So, Zelina is going to...
Do you hear me?
Professor Mazower, welcome.
Yes. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Jelena.
Hi, Mark.
I'm so sorry. I apologize.
No problem. No problem. We're very happy to have a British be late 5 minutes, you know.
Yes, thank you.
But έχεις γίνει είσαι και λίγο Έλληνας, οπότε σε είναι...
Πρέπει να είναι το ελληνικό μέρος του αίματος μου. Ναι, ναι.
Ακριβώς αυτό. Λοιπόν, να ξεκινήσουμε.
Ναι.
Ωραία. Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Ευχαριστούμε για την παρουσία σας. Καλημέρα στη Νέα Υόρκη και στην Τουρκία και σε διάφορα άλλα μέρη. Το Ινστιτούτο Μεσογειακών Σπουδών του Ιδρύματος Τεχνολογίας και Έρευνας συμμετέχει στον εορτασμό των 200 χρόνων από την Επανάσταση του 1821 με μια σειρά διαλέξεων, σεμιναρίων για την Επανάσταση. Και ο σκοπός μας είναι να αναπτύξουμε έναν ουσιαστικό διάλογο, όχι απλώς να παίρνουμε και να λέμε διαλέξεις και να κάνουμε έναν διάλογο σχετικά με την υφιστάμενη βιβλιογραφία, τη νέα έρευνα και τις νέες ερμηνείες. Γι' αυτό είμαι ιδιαίτερα ευτυχής να ξεκινήσουμε αυτή τη σειρά των διαλέξεων με τον καθηγητή Mark Mazower. Δεν χρειάζεται συστάσεις, ίσως είναι ο πιο πολύ διαβασμένος ιστορικός της γενιάς του. For our foreign friends and scholars, we are very happy to start a series of events for the 200 years from the Greek Revolution. And Mark Mazower, you all know about him, but just a few words. Mark received his bachelor in classics and philosophy from the University of Oxford, an MA in international affairs from Johns Hopkins University, and his doctorate from University of Oxford. And before he ended up at Columbia University, Mark taught at Birkbeck University of London, at Birkbeck at the University of London, at the University of Sussex, and at Princeton University. So, Mark, kalos mas ήρθες, and welcome through the electronic waves, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I do hope next time you will visit us in Crete, and we will be able to have you in person.
I would like that. Thank you so much. And I didn't think when I accepted your invitation that it would involve me standing in my bedroom as opposed to being with you in Crete. So next time in Crete for sure. And thank you for inviting me. And I want to just share some thoughts about this. It's not really going to be a formal lecture to save as much time as possible for discussion. And I, like many of you, I guess I've not really satisfactorily solved the problem of Zoom and figuring out the combination of looking into the camera and reading. So if I'm not looking at you the whole time, please forgive me. Okay. So the title, I think, the subject that we wanted to talk about was how did the Greeks win? And that's a very good question because in fact, at the start, nobody expected them to win. And most of the members of the Philikieteria did not think that they would be able to win on their own. And this is exactly why Alexandros Ypsilantis played up and at a certain point appears to have persuaded himself that the Russians were going to come in once he had marched across the River Pruth in February 1821. It was in a way a homage to the impossibility of victory without Russian backing. And of course, it wasn't just Ypsilantis who felt that way. And we can talk more about Ypsilantis and what he thought and what he knew and what he thought he knew about the Russians. But it wasn't just Ypsilantis. Virtually everybody believed that the Russians were going to intervene and that you could not win, the Greeks could not win without a Russian intervention. And that was, of course, the basis for the hesitation of the notables of the Morea, and it was the basis for the hesitation of Lazaros Koundouriotis and most of the notables of Hydra. a large proportion of the Greek elite refused to move or did not want to move unless the Russians were going to come in. And of course, the opposition to Xylantis' leadership of the Philiketteria was based on the same premise, that this was an absolutely disastrous thing to do. And those opponents of his who felt most strongly about this were those who were best placed to know that the Russians were not going to come in. That is to say, Kapodistrias himself, Ignatios in Pisa, and so on. So it was clear to almost everybody that this was a kind of suicidal venture if the Greeks were to go it alone and they couldn't win. Why did they think that? Well, for some obvious reasons that are not so obvious that historians really say much about them. There was a massive disparity in the manpower available to the two sides. So the Ottoman army was not large by the European standards. It was scarcely, I doubt it was a sixth the size of the Russian army, but they could still mobilize against the Greeks, thought Prince Alexandros Kantokouzinos in the autumn of 1821, at least 60,000 men, one way or another. The Greeks, it was doubtful whether they could easily mobilize more than 15,000. And of course, the disparity in terms of which of those were armed and which of those were experienced in fighting was even greater. But behind that, there was a much greater disparity still, and that was the disparity in what you could call fiscal reach. So one side you had an empire that was nothing if not an imperial bureaucracy. And although it was undergoing a fiscal crisis of significant proportions in the 1820s, they could accumulate resources to put men in the field. The Greeks had no such organization. We can talk about what they cobbled together. And in any case, the resources that were available to the Greeks were far less significant in almost all domains than the resources that were available to the Ottomans. Arguably, the fleet is one exception to that we can talk about. But if you put aside the fleet, in every other way, there was a huge disparity in resources. And so in some ways, the outcome of 1821 to 22 is not that surprising. That is to say that the Ottomans crush the Greek uprising in the Danubian principalities fairly easily, in the not only in the absence of Russian intervention, but with the Russians raising no objection to their sending their own army into the Danubian principalities. The communities of Asia Minor were intimidated and in some cases massacred. The same would apply to Cyprus. The plans that the Philiketteria took quite seriously for a massive uprising in Constantinople itself went nowhere because of the terror campaign that was designed to thwart that against the Greeks of Constantinople. The Chalkidiki Peninsula was pacified, and the vast swathe of territory from Ioannina eastwards, including the islands of Thasos and Samothraki and others, all were kept without too much difficulty under Ottoman rule. Northern Greece was crushed by the spring of 1822. And of course, in the Eastern Aegean, the massacre on Chios ensured that Samos would remain a kind of outlier for most of the war. Very valuable outlier, very important outlier, but an outlier. In Crete, the revolt rumbled on, but was essentially contained and more or less brought to a temporary halt when the Egyptians came in. So that left Rumeli, or the southern part of what the Ottomans understood as Rumeli, and Morea. And that's really what we're talking about from that point on, because none of the other territories ever came back into play. And of course, it was primarily the Morea that we're talking about, because it was only in the Morea where the Greeks achieved a kind of unquestioned predominance from the start. How did they achieve that predominance? They achieved that predominance in a number of ways. First of all, demography. Demographically, it was the most unambiguously Greek Christian area of all those that were being fought over. And the Ottoman grip on the peninsula suffered as a result of that. Secondly, of course, probably the Ottomans would have kept the Morea had it not been for Ali Pasha, and the fact that Khurshid Pasha had left the Morea and taken a large number of troops with him to lay siege to Ioannina, because that was the priority for the Sultan. And so the resources available in 1821 for the Sultan were relatively restricted. It's not clear how worried the Sultan was and how confident he was that he was going to reconquer the Morea in 1822. It seems to me he had to be fairly sure in his own mind that they were going to reconquer the Morea in 1822 without too much difficulty. But there was one exception to that, and that was a very important one, and that was already in the summer of 1821. The Spetsiote fleet in particular had prevented Ottoman reinforcements being sailed from the coast of Asia Minor to the Peloponnese. And so you started to see a much more important underlying factor behind all of this, which is the Morea was at the end of some very long supply lines for the Ottoman Empire. And so it was a kind of test of the efficiency of the imperial logistical machine, if I can put it that way, and a test that it failed. Why did it matter? And all of this is really just summarizing the findings of 10 or 15 years of recent research by a number of historians, of course. Why did this matter? First of all, because the campaigning season was relatively short. In effect, it was a seasonal, war was a seasonal activity that got going in April and ended in November. And only in very exceptional circumstances, or when you were in the grip of people who didn't play by the rules, like Ibrahim Pasha and the Egyptian army, did you in fact have a longer campaigning season than that. And that was a reflection of the constraints that the Ottoman administration faced on recruiting manpower. They were, as we now know, heavily dependent on a kind of brokerage and entrepreneurial system that brought in Albanian bands who basically operated on this kind of seasonal logic and were very quick to leave for one reason or another. And this was a perennial problem for the Ottomans at this point, that they had their serious doubts about the reliability of the Albanians, well-founded doubts, but they had very few alternatives. And the supply available to them from what would now be northern Greece, from Asia Minor, was very limited. Having said all that, one would have thought that in 1822, the Ottomans should have been able to reconquer the Peloponnese without a great deal of difficulty. And surely the Sultan expected that this would happen. And I think that's why the events of 1822 in the Peloponnese and the failure of Drameli Pasha in particular are so absolutely important, because they reveal the shortcomings of the Ottoman supply chains, some poor strategic decisions, his reliance on Albanian troops who turned out to reach Argos and then want to head home. On the other side, in Western Greece, the fact that Messolongi could hold out with virtually no defensive fortifications worth the name against two experienced Ottoman generals speaks volumes, I think, to the crisis that the Ottoman military was in. And then surely the third factor that maybe historians haven't paid enough attention to is the fallout from the fall of Ali Pasha, and in particular, Khurshid Pasha's fall from grace. And his suicide, almost certainly suicide, at the orders of the Sultan at the end of 1822, which deprived the Ottoman army of a very effective commander-in-chief. And so by the end of 1822, the Greeks have held out in the Peloponnese and indeed held out in part of Rumeli as well, and all the shortcomings of the Ottoman military have been on display. And then you have 3 years of effective stalemate in which neither side is really able to deal a knockout blow to the other. Neither side is able to win, and neither side is able to reorganize itself effectively in those 3 years, although both sides make a start. I think one side more effectively than the other. The Greeks, for instance, and this is a pretty, I think, damning indictment of the Greek way of war, the Greeks never manage even to conquer Patras the entire time. I mean, there are other ports as well, other forts as well, but Patras remains in Ottoman hands throughout. So the Greeks are unable even to say that they have unquestioned predominance in the Morea, which I think is a problem for them diplomatically. And people at the time, their supporters, feel that's a problem for them. But I think even more tellingly, the Ottoman army, after the defeat of Fall of Alipasha in the summer of 1822, simply fails to invade the Peloponnese again. It's staggering. I mean, that's the last time that there is an effective invasion from the north. It's as though the logistical problems are insurmountable for the Ottomans. So they're facing a kind of system failure in which they're going to have to reorganize themselves navally and militarily. And so you have a stalemate, and the stalemate is another way of saying that time drags on. But the dragging on of time has unequal consequences. And I remember being struck when I read a fascinating analysis of this whole scenario, written some point in 1825 by the Neapolitan minister in London, a man called Landulf, who was a very experienced diplomat and who had the misfortune of having to try to advise one of Europe's more stupid sovereigns, the King of Naples, and to persuade him of the inevitable. And Landulf said this, he said essentially all the great powers started off assuming that the Greeks would lose. However, they assumed that they would lose quickly. And this was the basis upon which they were willing to ignore popular Philhellenism and give the Ottomans their head to remain faithful to the anti-revolutionary premises of the Holy Alliance. But the more time drags on, he says, the more difficult it is for the powers to allow this situation to continue. And the more difficult it is for the powers to present the struggle of the Greeks as a revolutionary radical struggle like that of the Carbonari, rather than the struggle of enslaved Christians being tyrannized by a Muslim despot. And the more time goes on, the more Europe will read this as letting Christians down. And therefore, time is working on the side of the Greeks. All they have to do is not be defeated. It was a very interesting analysis, I thought. As I said, in the years 1823-25, in the midst of this stalemate, both sides are reorganizing their war machines. I would put it like this: the Greeks fail and the Ottomans basically succeed. That might be a counterintuitive conclusion. What do I mean by the Greeks fail? The Greeks fail, for instance, to utilize the proceeds of the 2 English loans to do anything that will improve their military situation. On the contrary, as far as I can tell, that money is entirely used for internal purposes. It's basically used in a factional war that will lead Idra to come out on top and that will benefit the Rumeliot soldiery, which is another way of saying it benefits the one group who had absolutely no interest in the building up of a regular army. And it strengthened the Greek view that military reorganization and European tactics were not going to succeed in this particular war. And very little of the money, if I read Bozikis correctly, very little of this money goes to anything worthwhile as far as the war venture is concerned. For instance, very little goes to building up fortifications around the Peloponnese to ward off a possible invasion by the Ottomans or the Egyptians and so on. As far as I can tell, relatively little goes into re-equipping the ships for future conflict. But I want to hear more about that from my host. On the other hand, I think that the Ottomans can be said to succeed in one way or another. The Sultan succeeds because he realizes he has to bring in Mehmet Ali and the new army of Ibrahim Pasha and Suleiman Pasha. And we all know what happens with that. It just marches into the Peloponnese at an ungentlemanly time of year, that's to say February 1825, when all self-respecting Greek soldiers and Albanian soldiers are back at home. And they basically launch a kind of blitzkrieg on the Peloponnese. They do not conquer the Peloponnese, but they prove the effectiveness of a military arm, of an army organized on regular European lines, to which, as far as I can see, the Greeks have absolutely no response. And they're saved only by the fact that in the spring of 1826, Kutaya Pasha requests Ibrahim to help him conquer Missolonghi, which of course he does. But Kutayu Pasha also, he doesn't preside over reorganization of the army, but he does everything that you can do with the old style Ottoman army, to the point of course, conquering Athens in 1827, the one time that the Greeks assemble a significant force for a pitched battle in open country, led by European officers, badly led by British officers. And of course, it's a crushing defeat for the Greek side. So militarily, time is working against the Greeks. And you'd have to say that by the summer of 1827, things are looking very, very bad for the Greeks. On the other hand, the other factor that is at play in this race against time is the appeal to the sympathies of Europe. And I think both sides are aware that European sympathies are changing and that the Holy Alliance, this ban on intervention on the side of Greeks, will only last so long because the Russians will only put up with it so long. The Sultan can do relatively little to halt this process because he basically sees any European intervention in his own affairs as illegitimate. But I think his military generals have a strategy and a diplomatic strategy, and that's called submission. That is to say, the more they can get the Armatols of Rumeli to sign Cappadocia to formally submit to Ottoman rule, the more they can get the villages of the Peloponnese formally to submit to Ottoman rule, the more they can go to Europe and say, there is no rebellion. The rebellion is over. And this isn't my interpretation. This is, of course, what terrifies the Greeks and what worries Kolokotronis, and why he says in his memoirs he was never so scared as that time in the summer of 1827, when the trend of submission moved from Rumeli to the Peloponnese, and the villages of the North and West Peloponnese, and then down into Messenia, started submitting in their dozens to Ibrahim Pasha. He realizes this could be fatal for the Greek cause. And on the other hand, the Greeks are doing what they can to mobilize Philhellenic sympathies in Europe and to get intervention. And I think where they are very fortunate is that their goal of mobilizing Philhellenic sympathy coincides with the goal of the British Foreign Minister and then briefly Prime Minister George Canning, who has another goal. His goal is to smash the Holy Alliance. And he starts to see that he can use the Greek case as the means to split Russia off from Metternich and from Austria. And so British policy and Greek policy coincide, and the result of that is the Battle of Navarino. And with the Battle of Navarino, I would say, in a way, miraculously, the Greeks have won the war. So my conclusion would be that the Greeks won the war. How? By not losing it. It was the only way in which they won this war. They came within a hair's breadth of losing the war. If it had been a matter of another few weeks and the Egyptian troops had sailed round to Idra and Spetsi, you can make a pretty strong case for saying that the war would have come to an end. All they had to do to win was not to be defeated. The Sultan had to win, and he had to win reasonably quickly, and he failed. So thank you very much. Those are a very summary set of thoughts, and I look forward very much to having a discussion.
Thank you, Mark, very much. You have, from what I know, you've written a book on the Greek Revolution. When shall we hope to have this?
It'd be later this year, I think sometime in the autumn.
Okay.
It will basically say what I just said, but at interminable length.
Okay, this is brilliant. Okay, thanks. Right, so I don't think it's, maybe I must start making questions, but I think we should leave them to the floor. It usually takes some time with this kind of communication. But yes, maybe how did you find, because you didn't, maybe because you're afraid of me here, I think you didn't mention anything about ships or fleet or whatever you said. You said, I'll say it. So how do you think the importance, the existence of a fleet, of a very important fleet actually, was helped this prolongation of the war. I loved what you, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense of what you say about not losing the war, because that, I mean, what do you think about the fleet of the Greeks?
Well, I mean, let's think about the ways in which the fleet did or didn't contribute. The fleet gets the islands into the war. There's no question. And then, in fact, the fleet, that is to say, the ships. I know that from your work that we're talking about many more places, but essentially the ships that are under the command of either Sympathies and Sarah need the other islands for their resources to keep them going. I think strategically, the fundamental contribution was made in 1821 and 1822, and probably also by the continued possession of Samos, which allowed for a kind of check on sailing from Asia Minor at a crucial time. So I wouldn't downplay the decisive importance of the fleet. On the other hand, and I would love to hear your thoughts about this, there are many areas in which the fleet cannot make a decisive move. I mean, ultimately, the fleet cannot prevent the fall of Missolonghi, and it cannot prevent the fall of Athens. So there are limits to the usefulness of the fleet. And then there's a whole question of payment. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have the ships, and you may or may not have ships who are willing to fight, but they also need to make a living. And so the presence of the ships is one thing, and what they're doing is quite another. And, you know, I bow to you on this, but my sense is that over time, increasingly, the merchant marine is less and less useful for the Greek authorities. Because, why? Because they have no money. And so the crews are not really willing indefinitely to pursue the strategic goals that may be set by the Prosorini Dikisi or whatever it is. They need to make money, and they need to plunder, and they need to privateer, and they carry out what the Europeans call acts of piracy. They're not a reliable resource. And actually, you can see that in the last phase of the siege of Missolonghi. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's decisive early on, is how it seems to me. And of course, it's a factor that keeps the Ottomans occupied. And also there's this strange correlative to that, which is the timidity of the Ottoman admirals. Mm-hmm. When the Egyptians come in, they seem to be a lot less timid of the Greek ships and to pay much less attention to them. And the casualties on the Greek side at sea rise quite a lot, and the impact falls. Mm-hmm. So that's just some provisional thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Now, from what, I mean, this is from the research that we have done, and we have talked about, when I say the fleet, it is important, I think, because when we say fleet, one thinks of Idris, Petsus, and Sarah and thinks about the warships, okay? But as you know, there were about 600, 700 merchant ships fully armed, out of which about 60, which I found an average of 48 with about 25 fire ships, okay, was the average expeditions. There were 30 expeditions we have calculated now, okay? So big expeditions that really had an effect. But that was not from, I think that prolonging the war, the fleet was very important. Mm-hmm. Because there is the auxiliary fleet of the privateers. Mm-hmm. And what has been underplayed a lot in the Greek historiography is the importance of privateers. Mm-hmm. Because we have found that they have issued privateer passports since 1822 and then on, and they were used for apoklismos, to embargo, to stop the supplies of all the Ottoman castles, right? And also during the time of disintegration in 1827, Codrington said, you know, privateers, just attack, okay? Attack the enemy whenever you can, all right? And then the privateering as well, it was, yes, we know there's the thin line with piracy, okay? And we have found lots of documents, and this is what still to be, I mean, starting this archival research on shipping, we have felt that we have, although we're a big group, we have felt we really have touched now a huge source, you know, of documents that we have not dwelt in. So there is, yes, as I said, a thin line between privateering and piracy, but a lot of the booty went back and was given to the Ethniko Tamio, and Bozikis is probably the only one that has calculated this, right? And also privateering brought money to the and feeding and survival to the local island communities. Okay, and apart from all this, it was also a continuous flow of cargoes. I mean, we found a lot of hundreds, thousands of small traveling between the ports, you know, for supplies, okay? So, and also of communication with the ship. So I think here is a really important force. And we of course find ships that go beyond the Aegean, you know, trying to, and also doing trading in the Black Sea or a little bit in the Adriatic and so on. So we have not really given, I think, as much attention to the importance of these movable assets that were not only a war machine, but were also bringing some money and sustaining their populations, and also attacking and weakening the enemy. Because la guerre de course, for example, during the American Revolution was very important. Okay? They knew about that. They lived with privateers in the 18th century. So I think this is something that we are really now understand. So that is just to add up to your comment on that.
No, I've learned an enormous amount from your own work and the work that you've done with others. So I'm not in a position to add very much. I guess one question I would have for you would be how effective you think those blockades were.
Yeah, this is from the documents we have found that they are confiscating grain cargoes, supplies, and so on. So that goes back to the it is either, you know, sold in Syros or it comes back. And also the other very important thing we have found is Syros, you know, which is you have a neutral port to sell and purchase booty as well, right? So anyway, I think we should open up to the...
I leave it to you. Do you want to field the questions, Jelena? Do you want to do it like that you select questions?
Well, we can...
however you want.
Yeah. Oh yes, goodness, we have lots of questions in the. Let's start with the ones that are with Apostolos Delis. Continue with Megapanos, and then I'll go to the questions that have been raised to the by the participants. Yeah, Apostolos.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Mazower, for the lecture. If I can help with this discussion about the Navy, I think we have to take into consideration two factors. One is the ships, and the other is the men. About ships, we have to remember that the Greek fleet was composed of merchant ships of small size, brigs, and had to face large warships, not only from the Ottoman Empire, but also from the Barbary states, from North African states that contributed to the Ottoman side. They fought next to the Ottoman side. But the important thing here is that the sailors that manned the Ottoman Navy up to the outbreak of the War of Independence were not all of them, but an important part was coming from Hydra, Spetses, and from the island Aegeans, from the islands of the Aegean. This is very important to remember that I presume that the Ottomans in this occasion had to man again the fleet and they didn't have at their availability sailors who were very experienced and had fought a long time in Ottoman Navy. At the same time, these merchant brigs that Greeks used in the Greek War of Independence and the men from Hydra, Spetses, Psara, etc., were also very well experienced in the warfare. Because during the Napoleonic Wars, and the Greeks were doing trade in the Mediterranean, had to face the British Navy, French ships, pirates, corsairs from Barbary shores. So for 30 years, all these men were very much experienced, not in ordinary naval warfare, but in a violent situation, in a context of war, blockades, and fighting. So the Greek ships, from the research that Jelena Halaftis conducted with this group in the previous project, the Afi Treaty, we saw that all of these ships had guns, and people were armed and experienced in fighting. So these are very important factors when we try to see how the Greek fleet, which was not a standard warfare war fleet as the European one or as the Ottoman one, which was, besides that, from the early years of the 19th century, was built on European models by Selim III. So it was pretty much a modern fleet. The Greeks, despite that, managed to contain, to control, to not to lose, as you said, from the Ottoman Navy.
Absolutely. Well, yeah.
They could not win. They could not win with this fleet because it was not a war fleet. Could not beat in an open battle easily. You can do it once as you do it in Samos. You can do it twice, perhaps, but you cannot do all the time with Egyptian fleet or the Ottoman fleet. It was far more modern and of higher firepower. But they used the same type of guerrilla warfare they used on land. That means fire ships. They used fire ships because this was the equivalent of guerrilla at sea, and this was what they could do. The success and the contribution, to my view, in this war was that they managed to control basic lanes around Peloponnese. Hydra and Spetses never conquered, never destroyed like Kassos or Psara, and was always for the Ottomans a threat. It was always there, the Greek Navy. They could not face a disaster by Greeks, the Ottomans, but it was something that they had a problem always to solve out. So that is more or less what I have in mind when I examine these facts about the naval warfare.
You could go further. I mean, I agree with everything you said. You could go further. Why do the Europeans get involved? Would they have got involved if it had been entirely a land conflict? I'm not sure that they would have done. The Serbs had been rising up some years earlier. Nobody in Europe much cared. Well, of course, the Serbs weren't the Greeks and they didn't have this cultural capital of ancient Greece. But I think the other factor is the naval presence, the disruptive presence of the Greek marine, whether it's fighting Ottomans or Egyptians or just carrying out pirate raids on merchantmen. It is creating a zone of instability. And that in itself is powerful. I agree with everything you said, really, and I've learned from your work. You know, it's a strange position to be giving my thoughts to people from whom I've learned so much. But I would add one thing that I haven't seen much discussed in the literature on the Navy, and that's casualty figures. I remember, you know, we can say you know, they were extraordinary in what they did. It's quite true. They were unbelievably courageous. It's quite true. The fire ship was work of genius, although of decreasing effectiveness over time. But we can admit all of that and still ask how many people actually died at sea and in the war. And the only figures that I've come across, and there must be lots of figures around the place. I remember reading Lignos, his history of the island of Hydra, and he has figures in there. And being rather surprised, perhaps I was reading them wrongly, and perhaps they meant something different to what I thought, but being rather surprised at how low the casualty figures were for the number of Hydriots who died at sea. Actually, more of them died on land, who died at sea in the first years of the uprising, which was why when there is this terrible tragedy on the Nerefs and it blows up, the island is in turmoil because they're not used to 50 or 60 people dying. It's very unusual. And so I just throw that out as a question for people to think about. You know, this was a kind of hit and run force. And so it was useful in some ways, and in other ways, it really couldn't have much impact at all.
Thank you. There is a pile of questions. I'm starting. I will go through some, and then I will go to Nikos and then to Antonis. So Olga Katsiardi-Herring wrote the very interesting lecture. Thank you. I would add to what Jelena mentioned that corsairs and pirates were a strong thread in the sea, and there I don't think that the war was lost. There is a question from, shall I make the questions 3 or 4 questions together, Mark?
Whatever you like, that's fine too.
Okay, well, a question from Amanatidis Georgios. How the internal fights between Greeks affected the Greek Revolution? Are these internal fights of Greeks considered by the speaker as a civil war?
Okay.
There is another one from Thanos Angelopoulos. Yes? I'll give you 3, Mark. So second one is, in your conclusion, this is by Thanos Angelopoulos. In your conclusion, you supported that the Greeks won the war by not getting defeated. Would it be possible for you to elaborate a little bit more on this point?
Okay.
I think I'll leave you in these 2, and then I will continue. Okay, Katerina, you will make the questions yourself that you've written? Yeah, okay, good. So I'll stop into that. And Olga added after that the blockade that the Greek ships, when you asked Mark that how they were affected, she says that the blockade that they did was really active.
So I see, yes.
Yeah.
So the internal struggles amongst the Greeks, and were they a civil war? On the semantic point is more easy, I think. I mean, I don't know how much hangs on whether you describe it as a civil war or not. A civil war, as we know from many civil wars, is a loaded term. There are conflicts in which one side says this was a civil war and the other side says it was not. Whether we're talking about the United States in the 1860s or Italy in the 1940s. Clearly Greeks were fighting Greeks. That's obvious, we know that. On multiple levels, and it's one of the things that has made reading detailed histories of the war so difficult for most people because the politicking involved is extraordinary. I suppose it depends what you expect. I mean, if you were to compare it with the American Revolution, it is striking that no single leader emerges. And people at the time say this, that there is no single leader who emerges who can unify the Greeks. And they see that as a weakness, but it's maybe also a strength in a funny kind of way. So that there is an enormous amount of internal politicking. Was there more than there had been in the French Revolution before the rise of Napoleon? I'm not sure. It seems to me inherent in the nature of revolutionary activities that you're going to get this. I think it is, what is very striking to me is that the Kunduriotis government knows for many months that the Egyptians are coming, does absolutely nothing about it. Everybody's minds are fixated on their internal enemies. There's something there about the reality of your internal enemy versus the unreality of the external enemy that I find worthy of explanation. How could they have been so fixated on these internal struggles? Because the other side of this so-called civil war is that it, in comparison with other conflicts, in comparison even with the conflict in the Peloponnese in 1821, well, we could have an argument about this. Were the levels of violence that Greeks inflicted on one another that high? I am not sure that they were, really. Again, I'd like to read more about this. Yes, civil war if you want, very important because it prevents an effective defense of the Peloponnese against the Egyptians. They could have defended it with much greater preparation and much more robustly than they did. Could I elaborate on they won by not being defeated? Well, I don't know how much more there is to say about this. I think it was impossible for the Greeks to win a military victory for all the reasons that we've talked about. They didn't have the right kind of armed forces, and I'll go out on a limb, Julina, and say they didn't have the right kind of naval forces either. They had naval forces that could stop the Ottomans winning. That was a very big achievement. That's not negligible. I'm not sure that they had the forces for a crushing blow, which is, you know, why the Philikieteria had presumed on two things. One was the Russians, and the other was blowing up the navy in Istanbul and setting fire to the city. But, you know, crazy idea, but testimony to the equally crazy idea that you would fight a war without those things and win it. So they hung on. So the other part of this that's interesting to me is, well, let's think about the situation in what was to become the Kingdom of Greece in, what shall we say, mid-September 1827. Ibrahim was predominant, but he hadn't won in the Peloponnese. But he had been very effective in getting more and more villages to submit to him. And that effectiveness, the swathe of villagers had descended from the northern coast of the Peloponnese down the west coast of the Peloponnese into Messenia. There appeared to be nothing that the Greeks could do about it. And Kolokotronis' strategy was a guerrilla strategy. So that it seemed to me that if the Egyptians had sailed to Idra, as I say, you can make a reasonable case that that Idra would have eventually gone the same way as Psara and Kassos and other places. And then it would have been Ibrahim in charge in the Peloponnese and the Ottoman army in charge in Rumeli. And where do the Greeks go from that? So that's what I mean, that they hung on to the very end point.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really a wonderful point, actually. There will be Nikos Megapanos, then Antonis Hadjikyriakou, and then Katerina Galani. Nikos.
Yes, thank you, Professor. It's brilliant, I think, take on the reasons why the revolution succeeded. Would you elaborate a little bit on why did the Ottoman army have such a success in the north part of what is Greece today in comparison to the unsuccessful attempts to fight off the revolution in the southern, in the Morea and the Rumeli, and would, apart, when you mentioned briefly the logistical failures of the Ottoman army, but would geography also play some part in that, into the fact that you have access to the South Peninsula more from the western side rather than from the east, or how did that play altogether? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want me to answer straight away, Jelena? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And you know, so here's I'll admit incompetence. You know, I haven't looked in as much detail in the struggle in, let's call it for now, northern Greece. It's too complicated. The whole swathe from Ioannina east to Thraki. I haven't looked in as much detail in that. And, you know, subconsciously, that's probably because ultimately they remain under the Ottomans, as I've thought about the Morea. But if I think about the differences, there are a number of differences. First, the geography and the logistics and the structure of power, with powerful bays, with access to large numbers of armed men, makes it a completely different terrain. It's tougher for the Ottomans around Naousa and west than it is east of there, in the hinterland of Thessaloniki and Ceres and so on. But the logistical problems are surmountable. They're straightforward. The communications are much easier. The available manpower is much greater. The demographics work in the favor of the Ottomans in a way that's simply not true. There may be another factor, but I'd be curious about this. The Greek notable class, the elite in the Peloponnese, are basically strong-armed into the revolution. They get to the point where, you know, with 4 or 5 weeks out, everybody realizes they have no choice. Because even if, you know.
No, yes.
It was very dramatic. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. This is all, Greece is very great drama, so but drama plays. So that's.
I do apologize.
Okay, no problem.
You want me to go on, or should we go on with more questions?
Yes, we had Nikos, you presented. You have to know that we have a lot of PhD students. Well, we have many questions from PhD students. Nikos is a mature PhD student, just started on the shipping fleet of Messalongi, which nobody knows about that, which was very important. So, Andonis Katzikiriakou now.
Thank you, and thank you, Mark, for this fascinating presentation. And I think the Turkish colleagues in the audience, who I was very happy to see, I think they heard a very familiar story, at least as far as the nationalist Turkish narrative of the Greek Revolution is concerned, which is called, first of all, the Peloponnesian Revolt. Mm-hmm. I.e., it's not a revolution, it's a revolt, and it's limited to the Peloponnese. Mm-hmm. And secondly, it was a war that was lost due to European intervention. You know, that's a very short summary of how the Greek Revolution is understood in official Turkish historiography. Mm-hmm. And you know, given the discussion that you had earlier about the war at sea, in 1944, there was actually the first Turkish history of the Greek Revolution. The narrative, the gist of the argument of which was winning at land, losing at sea. Mm-hmm. And I think this ties very nicely with the point that you're making. And the author who was teaching at the Naval Academy in Turkey, he's making the point that, you know, once the Greeks revolted, you no longer had manpower for the Ottoman fleet, and that was something that gave a huge advantage to the rebels. But really, it was the Battle of Navarino that completely shifted the tables. And of course, this is something that we all know. But I wonder what your take would be concerning this kind of narrative that focuses, that kind of downplays, let's say, the role of the revolution, or the revolutionary processes, the role of external factors in the form of European independence.
Παρακαλώ, μπορείτε να... Αλεξία Καραδίμου, να κλείσετε το μικρόφωνο σας. Αλεξία.
Με συγχωρείτε πολύ, με συγχωρείτε.
Okay. Okay, go on.
And thank you. You know, other factors such as Philhellenism, other factors such as the cultural capital that you mentioned, you know, how would you situate them against this kind of narrative that often has sort of, you know, the more narrow nationalistic connotations from the Turkish side of things, I mean.
So thank you, Antonis. So, you know, in laying out very schematically a set of thoughts about what it would mean to say the Greeks won, one necessarily doesn't talk about a lot of other things. So let me talk about some of those things that you raised. And one was revolt, apostasia, I suppose, not revolution. We could have a long and interesting discussion about what we should call what happened in 1821. But if you judge by outcomes, there's no question in my mind that it was a revolution. And I don't want to take up a lot of time in this, but then by virtually every parameter that you can look at, the nature of political authority, the ruling religious creed, the administrative structure, property rights, the functioning of the economy, the nature of the society, it's a revolution. There's no question about that. So it's a more interesting question whether it started out as a revolution. And I think it started out as different things to different people. And I'll leave it at that for now. But there's some of them, it's clearly revolutionary. For a lot of the peasants, I think it would be something slightly different, an aftaxume toromeko, which isn't quite the same thing as a revolution, really. Well, maybe it's a revolution from a theological point of view. So you get my drift. I think to describe it as an apostasia, as of course many people did at the time, is to miss the transformative quality of what happened over 7 or 8 years. They lost through European intervention. Well, that's true and it's not true at the same time, because when you say that they won by not being defeated, it would be easy to assume that that was a small thing, but that was no small thing. There was no small thing not to be defeated. And it's interesting to me that we are still very much locked in the mindset of figuring out who contributed, as it were, militarily or navally to that not being defeated. But ultimately, it seems to me to come down to a question of the agrarian economy and the peasantry, because everybody who was put into the field, who stayed in the field, who was manning the ships, was being resourced largely out of the Greeks' own production and own resources. And so the big mystery to me is how this agrarian economy kept functioning sufficiently through these years of war, which by 1825-26 were devastating in the Peloponnese as well as everywhere else, functioning sufficiently to generate a surplus that would keep this war effort going. I would put it in those terms. If you put it in those terms, it isn't just that George Canning can use this for his purposes because this exists. This resistance exists, and resistance isn't a negligible quantity. So you must forgive me if I skated over a lot of things, but there is this complex interplay between a kind of degree, a surprising degree of social organization at the village level, which is missed by the historians who fixate on the battles and the colloquy. You know, from occasionally you get glimpses in the archives of what the villagers in Karytina around there really thought Delian is sending his capos in to get the harvest, or Kolokotronis is then sending his guys in to get the harvest. I mean, as far as they're concerned, everybody's coming in and wants a bit of their harvest. And they seem to me the, you know, understudied stratum. And the same in the islands and the same in Rumeli, who keep the thing going until you could say it really is. I mean, Ibrahim has a strategy that he has developed in the Hijaz in 1817 that he employs in the Peloponnese. He's going to literally uproot the agrarian economy. He understands how the Greeks kept going. So that's just a short answer.
Thank you, Mark.
Sorry, thank you, Mark. Katerina Galani now, please.
Well, there are a lot of things in my mind. I really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. And I very much like the argument about dragging in the Europeans just because we were a maritime nation, or because we had such a big commercial fleet in the 18th century. So we had to somehow get them involved. And it is no coincidence that Britain comes in first and acknowledges the status first. Right. I like to comment about the agrarian economy, but if I can pitch in, there's definitely a commercial economy, because what the research project corroborated is that we have a continuation of the merchant fleet during the war. And this is a bit that we were losing before from the literature. We do know that the European markets closed down for the Greeks because there's a lot of things going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we are not really in the position to go again to Genoa or Marseille or whatever. But there is quite a vivid internal economic activity, domestic economic activity, I mean maritime activity. And what we see from the customs of Nafplio or Tinos or Syros is that we have an influx of ships coming in, Greek ships with a Greek flag. So there's definitely a lot of trade going on because of the war and aside of the war. And we're able to quantify that, and it's quite impressive actually. And on the effectiveness, the last comment, and please, I would love to hear your point on that. On the effectiveness again of the war at sea, which led to the prolongation, I think that there's a clear shift in priorities from the Ottoman side in 1824. I think it's becoming clear that they need to reshift their attention at sea, and they need to cut the supply lines to the castles of the mainland, and to do so they have to attack the islands. So we have Kassos and Psara, but there are lots of islands, more islands that they are never conquered. Well, that's pretty much evident. And the fact that they are never conquered, although it was a clear shift in the strategy of priorities and so on, and the joint, of course, fleet of the Egyptians and the Ottomans, I think it is definitely an indication of a success of war at sea. The fact that this new priority, this new strategy did not come to success from the Ottoman side. It's on the Greek side, it's definitely a great win.
You see, this is where it would be so interesting to have, maybe it exists, but I don't know, the discussions going on in Istanbul in 1824 about what the strategy for the coming year should be.
It's targeting the islands, and making sure that there will not be any supply lines to the castles of the mainland.
Well, but they target Psara and Kassos. But as far as I can see, nobody's bothered about Tinos.
They go for Samos, and that's why we have all the victorious battles around Samos, three victorious battles, and then they go for Spetses, and then they go for Hydra.
Right, exactly.
So it's consecutive attacks, which fill into a wider plan.
Yes, that makes sense. Yes, so no, that's very interesting, and I'd love to know more about that. And it does seem that there is some change of heart in 1824, as you say, which is surely connected to the Egyptians playing a much more dominant role in things. On the British and the war at sea, absolutely. I've always thought one of the most interesting figures in this was the captain of the Cambrian, Hamilton, who Gawain Hamilton, who's there from 1822, if not 1821, very involved. There's no good biography of him. He surfaces at crucial moments for both sides. It would be, he was a key source of information, I think, as he was for Codrington later on, by which time he really knew the situation very well. And he had very good contacts with both sides. But trade, absolutely. And, I've read the book that you guys have done on 1821 and the merchant marine, and it's a revelation to see how much trade is just continuing, and to have confirmed what you could infer from scattered stories that one has come across in other documents, that the not just among Greeks, but the communications with merchants in Constantinople or Alexandria seem pretty robust. There's evidently a good deal of trade going on there in Greek ships right through the war. So to set the war in this commercial setting is, that seems to be something that you've done very effectively in that collected volume, and that we're going to all have to take account of.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The book is not out, as yours will be later on, but there is a lot of research, and it is amazing as the time goes on and more things getting published. You need to redo them. Yeah, it's amazing. But I think it's one of the good things about this epetios, this celebration, okay, the occasion, because it's really focused again back to real research from historians. So a question from Manolis Kanakis. We go one by one now, Mark, okay? How much the massacres of Chios, Psara, and Kassos weighed in the decision of the European powers to support, or at least not to oppose directly, the revolution?
Well, the outrage, this is just my own impressions. Everybody will have their own impressions from what they've read. My impression is that there's real outrage at the news of the massacre in Chios, but it subsides. Just as there had been real outrage in Europe at the hanging of the patriarch in 1821, but it had subsided. It hadn't led to a transformation. I think that with the coming of the Egyptians, things start to change. But my impression is that the decisive event is really the fall of Messalongi in 1826, which comes upon a growing anxiety about slavery, excuse me, and about the Egyptian plans for the Peloponnese. So that if I had to look at it, I would say that the change in attitude is happening in 1825 and 1826. And the Russians are telling the British in 1825 that Ibrahim has a plan of extermination. He's going to wage a war of extermination. And the British get very worried about that. And they're worried about it in a way that they weren't before. And it's difficult to know whether that just reflects the fact that Canning is now very much in charge in a way that he had not been. In 1822, he'd come in September 1822. And although he's not what I would count as a Philhellene, he finds this very disturbing. So there's some sea change that, as far as I can see, happens 1825, 1826, and brings the British and the Russians together.
Mm-hmm. So that fits, thank you. That fits well with the next question by Nikki Kritsovali that asks, what was the reason for the Russians' non-intervention? In
1821?
Yes.
I think there's a simple and a complicated answer to that. And the simple answer to that is that the Tsar was more worried about revolution in Europe than he was about the fate of the Christians in the empire. And by 1825, that's flipped around, and he's much more worried about the fate of the Christians in the empire. I was going to say, one other thought occurred to me about the previous question, actually, about the massacres. I think there are three separate kinds of atrocity that we might usefully disentangle in trying to think about the European reaction, which is to say massacre, enslavement, and the uprooting of vines. The general tendency amongst many European diplomats, they don't go as far as Metternich, but for many of them, massacre is the condition of these parts of the world. They can accommodate a high level of rather nasty, barbarous killing of civilians. Slavery on a mass scale is a different matter, because there is a massive debate going on, and especially in France in 1825 and 1826, around the abolition of slavery in Haiti and compensation for the slave owners of Haiti. France in particular is primed to be outraged at the stories coming out of Messalongi and the Peloponnese. So the stories of the mass enslavement of Christians activate a public outrage that massacre itself, I think, had not done. And then in a strange kind of way, the thing that really freaks everybody out when they learn about it is that Ibrahim has these plans in the summer of 1827 to issue 10,000 axes to his soldiers to chop down and uproot the vines and the olive trees of Messenia and the Peloponnese. And pretty tough people go around and say, this is an absolute outrage, right? They can live with massacre, they can live with enslavement, but this, I mean, you read Kolokotronis's letters at this time, nobody's done this to us before. Obviously everybody takes slaves, there's no big deal. People kill each other from time to time, but uprooting the vines, and for Codrington too, this is like, this is a no-no. This is a sign that you are beyond the pale. So I would start to disaggregate the things that really press the European buttons.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was really good. Now you have Evangelos Iliomanis says, conveys congratulations for your interesting lecture. And question is, the revolutionaries couldn't resist the regular Egyptian army. Was it a matter of tactics, that is the small formations on which the Greeks fought, or was it the political fractional disputes?
Well, look, I'm not a military expert. That's the first thing to say. Well, let's go through it. They've pretty ruthlessly trained their army in Egypt. Ibrahim is many things, but one of them is he's a very charismatic military leader who leads from the front. He's had successes in the past. He's going to have great successes in the future. Against Ibrahim, you've got Yorgos Koundouris, who, according to the people writing the memoirs at the time, didn't know how to ride a horse. So, and certainly had no strategic sense at all, and wished he wasn't on dry land, but back on Idra. So there's no leadership on the Greek side to compare with this very formidable duo of Ibrahim. I mean, I just think it's a different league of strategic leadership. And the presupposition of the Greeks has always been, it doesn't really matter because guerrilla warfare is going to hold the day. And in the very long run, that might have been a reasonable position, provided you could hold the loyalty of the peasantry, which is why Ibrahim then targets the peasantry. But in those first few battles in Messenia and Laconia, in the spring and summer of 1825, the Egyptians rout the Greeks, and often the Egyptians are outnumbered by the Greeks, and they are simply bolder, and they're more willing to take them on. And once the Roumeliots have been routed and they leave, then you've got Kolokotronis desperately trying to round up a sufficient number of Peloponnesian bands after a year or so of civil war. And it's an impossible task. And by that point, the Egyptians have acquired a kind of mystique. People are terrified of them. And so the bands do what they do best, which is they lurk up in the hills and the mountains, and they can't really provide an effective defense of villages that these troops go and burn. All they can do is harry them before and after, which they do. And these troops are not bothered by that. They can take these losses because there will be more soldiers coming in from Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, Kostas Stradelos comments that we can find an unusual use of the term civil war concerning the events in Crete during the revolution and the clash between Christians and Muslims in C. Rochford Scott, as a book of 1837, Rumbles in Egypt and Candia. So,
thank you. I'll look at.
Yeah. So,
I know Rochford Scott, but I didn't remember that. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is your assistance from from our master's students.
Great.
So very well read, actually. Then Adam Papadopoulos asks which Greek community abroad was more active contributing in the revolution?
Well, there are so many that I don't know that it's, I don't know that you can put it like that. I mean, at the very beginning, of course, there is this immense contribution of the Greeks in southern Russia and Moscow, but southern Russia in particular, and the Danubian principalities. And they continue to play a role in the refugee crisis after that. After that, my impression is that there are not large Greek communities that play a role. And where there are large Greek or reasonably large Greek communities, they're often rather ambivalent towards the revolution. They're not necessarily ambivalent towards helping refugees, but the merchant communities of Marseille in particular, is deeply ambivalent about the revolution, right? And Julina, you must know much more about this than me, and Livorno perhaps too. And Trieste, there appears to be a lot of enthusiasm, but whether it's amongst the Greeks of Trieste or it's the Greek students coming down from the German universities, I haven't looked into it enough to know. So there are isolated Greek benefactors who remain absolutely fundamental. People like Ignatios in Pisa are, of course, very important figures. But a lot of the running in the Phil-Hellenic movement is not made by Greeks abroad at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, there were, like Varvakis, for example, from Taganrog also contributed, but there were particular cases that did that. That's true. From Zacharias Andon, I'm sorry about this, from Zacharias, he asks, thinking with the terms of the era, Kapakia was sometimes a part of a general plan, that is to let the enemy leave from the area. It wasn't always a defeat for the chief in arms of the area. Do you agree with that point of view? Oh, the Zacharias Andonakis, yeah. So that is also a military.
Yes, of course, that it was used for that too, but all I would say is, on the whole, I think there has been, until very recently, a reluctance to admit to what extent, especially in Rumeli, the Greek leaders in Rumeli were still playing by the old rules. They were not, and Kapakia were part of the old game, and that would apply to Androutsos and the rest of them. And that was not about encouraging the Ottomans to leave. That was about making the best of a difficult situation and shoring up your own personal power. That's how I would see it. But you're absolutely right. The other existed as well.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Mark. And the last question from Charalambos Katsenis. To what degree was Egypt independent from the Ottoman Empire, and what did the Ottomans promise to the Egyptians for Ibrahim's intervention?
Well, the whole Egyptian intervention was about the dynasty Mehmed Ali acquiring a kind of independence. That was his end game. He wasn't independent. He was the Pasha of Egypt. He had to do what the Sultan said, up to a point. He wouldn't leave Egypt when the Sultan asked him to, but he would try to accommodate important requests from the Sultan. What were they promised? They were promised the Pashalik of the Morea. So Ibrahim, in fact, became the Pasha of the Morea, as far as I remember, when he led the troops in 1825 into the Morea. And then there was an argument about who should control the Ottoman fleet that Mehmet Ali didn't win. I think what fascinated me is the kind of ambiguous game that these two men are playing, Mahmud II and Mehmet Ali. Mahmud needs Mehmet Ali. He needs him to come. He's lost without him. And Mehmet Ali needs to do what his Sultan says. But you can see the way this plays out on two occasions. One is shortly after the Canaris's attempt to send a fireboat into Alexandria, it fails, but they escape. And Mehmet Ali, who's there, is so furious that he jumps in a corvette, I think, and chases them. And so he's out of Alexandria for about a week. And while he's out of Alexandria, the Ottoman Navy, led by Khusrev Pasha, who's the Kaputan Pasha, suddenly and unexpectedly arrives in Alexandria for refueling. They've come from Mesolongi. Khusrev Pasha and Mehmet Ali are old and bitter rivals, dating back 20 years, nearly 20 years. And everybody thinks or worries that Khusrev Pasha has really come on the orders of the Sultan to topple Mehmet Ali. That tells you the nature of the relationship between the two. And in fact, he hasn't, and he behaves very properly. But there's a moment of tension until the Pasha returns, when nobody's very sure if this is the end of Mehmet Ali in Egypt. And then the second is the end game around Navarino. And even after Navarino, Mehmet Ali sends his son, and he tells his son that you have to do what the Sultan orders you to do. And then it becomes clear when Mehmet Ali learns about the Treaty of London that the three great powers are serious. And he tries to persuade the Sultan that he's on a kind of suicide course, that if the Sultan insists on a conflict, he will lose the Ottoman Navy. Of course, he turns out to be completely right about that. But he tells his son, you have to do what the Sultan says. You cannot listen to me on this. You have to listen to him. And of course, there is a lot of there's a lot of a double game in this, because although it doesn't suit Mehmet Ali to have the Egyptian fleet destroyed, it suits Mehmet Ali to have the Ottoman fleet destroyed. And it suits him to have the Sultan facing a disaster. And so the European diplomats are very struck at the different reaction that the Sultan shows when he learns about Navarino, which is one of unrestrained fury, to the reaction of Mehmet Ali, who is preternaturally calm. And I think the reason he's preternaturally calm is not only that he had foreseen this, but he sees in this the route to his eventual emancipation from the Ottomans. So they're connected in this very ambivalent, fascinating relationship.
Thank you, Mark. In a conference that the Athens University organized, I listened to Sukri Lichak, that cannot be unfortunately today with us, and it was amazing how he showed a map with all the conflicts that were happening at Edessade before the Greek Revolution. How the Ottoman Empire was an empire in transition. We all know about that, but what happened was that has not been, I think, and that's a great contribution, is that there were replacements of local governors, either by killing them more peaceful way, but it was really in a way an Ottoman, an empire in transition. Absolutely. And I think it came, the Greek Revolution for the Greeks came at a very good point. Yes. Apart from all the frontier wars that they had, all around. So, yeah. So we have reached 5:30, which was our limit of time for you today. And we want to thank you very, very much for a fascinating presentation and discussion and inspiration of ideas and so on. So we really look forward to see you in the near future in Crete and make more discussions.
Thank you so much, Jelena. Thank you. I found this an immensely interesting discussion to hear from everybody. It's given me a lot of food for thought. Thank you.
You're welcome. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you all for participating. We have a large number of foreign colleagues, okay, from Turkey, from France, and students from everywhere, and also people that are just interested. So we thank you all very much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.